first, actually. Yeah. Should we do this first?
It's on. Welcome everyone to the iChild Digital History Seminar. I'm delighted tonight to welcome Bob Nicholson, who is a senior lecturer at Edgehill University, who will be speaking on the topic of remixing digital archives in Victorian Mean Machine. Bob is a cultural historian who is interested in the media, and particularly jokes. Very well known for his interest in jokes. And hopefully this evening he'll be guiding us through not only remixing the archives, but trying his attempts, I guess, to enliven some of those Victorian jokes and give us a sense of why people found them funny, because as I'm sure we'll see, many of them to our own ears and eyes certainly are not. And I'll hand the floor to Bob.
Great. Thanks, James. Hi, everybody, and everybody at home as well. This is a slightly odd experience being on the other side of the camera for the first time for the seminar. So, hi. Yeah, as James mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about this idea of, as you can see, hopefully you can see my slides behind me, of remixing digital archives. And I'll talk more in a few minutes about what I mean by that. But first, just a little bit of context. As some of you know, I think particularly those of you in the room who I've met before and talked about this, or seen at various digital humanities events, about a year ago now, or maybe even just more than a year ago, I started working with the British Library Labs on a project to work, as James has mentioned, with Victorian jokes. For those of you who maybe don't know about the labs, they're a project within the British Library that aims to improve access to the British Library's digital collections and to encourage researchers and creative people to do more interesting and experimental things with some of those digital collections. And every year they run a competition where they invite people to pitch them ideas. And that's exactly what I did. Now, I'm conscious because as part of that project, I ended up sort of going around a lot of universities, different libraries and digital history seminars, talking about this project. And I'm sort of aware that maybe some of you have seen me talk about it before, so I thought I wanted to do something a little bit different today. But just to sort of, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about this before, a bit of a recap. So the idea I pitched to the British Library was this. What I wanted to do was to find a way to extract Victorian jokes from existing digital archives, and in particular from collections of newspapers and books, to process them, to OCR them, to tag them, and in the end to transform them into something like this, essentially a visual version of the joke, or a meme, hence the idea of the Victorian meme machine. The idea then was that this sort of visual recreation of the joke would be shared over social media, and then we would track what people did with them. And this, I should say, if you're interested in seeing what we've done already, was all done using our mechanical comedian, who you can follow if you have an appetite for terrible Victorian jokes, at Victorian Humour. Now, we worked on this for a few months, and I've been to sort of various events with the British Library talking about it. And I realised when I was preparing my talk for today that there was one question that I hadn't really answered about this project, largely because I didn't have time. But the question was probably the most important one, which is really why. Why on earth was I doing this? Why would I want to work with Victorian jokes in this way? And why on earth would we want to send them out over social media? And so that's sort of big question I really want to talk about in this talk, my motivations for working on this project. And I think perhaps what those motivations have to say about other ways we might work with digital data in its various forms. So to return to my title slide, what I really want to talk about today is this idea of remixing digital archives, and sort of doing new things with them, bringing them into contact with each other in new ways. So just a kind of quick menu of what we're going to talk about today. First thing first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the problem is with Victorian jokes. And it's not the problem you might be thinking, which is that they're not very funny. That is one of the problems, but there is another bigger problem, I think, which is perhaps stopping us from researching them and using them to our advantage. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would term archival remixing, which in this case I used to refer to changing the way in which archives are organised, breaking down some of the boundaries and structures that currently define the way which we use them. I'll talk a little bit then about creative remixing. And here I'm sort of thinking about how we take content from archives, give them to people, or indeed put them into computer programs that, I suppose, mix them up, do new things with them, and sometimes unexpected things. And finally, and I suppose throughout all this, I'm going to be talking about this Victorian jokes project. But I want to stress before we go on that even if you have no interest at all in Victorian jokes or internet memes, I hope that kind of the ideas underpinning the project, which is all about how we do our research, how we organise our archives, I think that could apply to a whole range of different projects. So let's start with this first bit, the problem with Victorian jokes. And generally, I think the problem that we assume they have is one of reputation, and namely well, I suppose, a rather bad reputation. And there's this wonderful portrait of Queen Victoria, which I absolutely love, which just captures exactly how we might imagine her, right, as the sort of the archetypal, glum, dour Victorian figure, famous, of course, for this phrase, which she may or may not have said. There's a great deal of debate on this. We are not amused. And this image of the Victorians has haunted them for a really, really long time. And for pretty much the Victorian period itself, these sort of stereotypes were in circulation. But this was somehow a humourless or dour age. And you still see this today. Whenever the Victorians are mentioned, ironically, the go-to joke about them is that they don't have a sense of humour. I think most recently, I always look out for these kind of little moments and make a note of them. The most recent one I saw, I think, was on the Great British Bake Off this year. So people watched that. They had a Victorian week. And one of the sort of gags that they came up with is that they had to make a not amused bouche, which, again, it's just a kind of lazy go-to gag about them, right? And I've got to the point where I'm kind of sick of this, right? Because I study the Victorians, I know that they've got a great sense of humour, that they're fun, and that there is another side to them than this. And so what I've been trying to do is to challenge some of these stereotypes in my work. And instead to maybe start to see Queen Victoria like this. This is an actual photo of her smiling in a carriage. And I love this because chances are you might not have seen it before. And yet it is, Queen Victoria laughing. It seems kind of at odds with how we imagine the Victorians. One of the very first blogs I wrote years ago when I first started blogging was just a picture of Victorians smiling. And occasionally it keeps getting picked up like BuzzFeed and those kind of sites, just because people think, wow, it's weird, Victorians smiling. It seemed extraordinary. And there are whole reasons why they might have been laughing. But certainly one of them is that joking was a big part of Victorian society, or at least that's what I'm trying to prove in my research. That when you start looking for Victorian jokes, not only do they exist, but they exist in enormous numbers. I've just got a few kind of little clippings here from various joke books, newspaper joke columns, from magazines. This is just obviously the tip of the iceberg. This is not a slide of all the Victorian jokes I could find. There are millions of them. They were published in newspapers, published in books. They were told on the music hall stage, around dinner tables at the pub. There is this sort of lively culture of joking that existed throughout the 19th century, despite all of the, in fact, the bad reputation that the Victorians have. Of course, most of this has been lost. This is the frustrating thing about jokes. They sit in that sort of liminal space between oral culture and textual culture. Occasionally, they drift into text and they get captured and sort of frozen in time. But generally, they exist in a slightly more fluid way. They get retold, they get adapted, passed on, changed, and occasionally those things are captured in print. And quite often, they're captured by accident. A lot of the jokes that have survived have not survived because somebody in the 19th century thought, this is such a great joke, we must preserve it for eternity. They're there in the margins, like stowaways, in more important texts. There's column fillers in newspapers, on the back page of a newspaper that was preserved for its political views. And so, I suppose what I'm interested in, what I really want to do in my work, is to try and recapture these jokes. This is the kind of position which I started from this project. It's this big question, how can I find these, how can I work with them, and how could other historians do the same? I don't just want to sort of find my own little private collection of these things. I want, maybe nobody else wants to do this, but I want the world to start looking at these jokes and seeing what they can do with them. So before we sort of maybe think about how we might do that from a technical point of view, I think it's worth just mentioning why it's worth doing. And again, just to kind of capture the centrality of joking to the 19th century before we talk about some more digital things. I don't have time to do this as there's a whole book in this that I don't have time to go through really, but certainly just a few nice little examples, I think, to capture this. This is a book called the Munsters Pocketbook, or The Art of Punning, which was written by a journalist called Charles Malloy Westcott, who was the editor of The Age, one of the great Sunday newspapers, writing at this point under the pseudonym Bernard Blackmantle, from 1826, actually pre-Victorian. What I really like about this is that it's a celebration of punning, the most Victorian kind of humour, really lame, tortured wordplay. And what this book does is just celebrate it as a great aspect of Victorian society. The book is filled with, I don't know if they're real or maybe invented examples of famous people cracking jokes. So here we have, the Duke of Wellington in action, as it were, but he's not, he's not on the battlefield. He's, making a quip. Or the Duchess of Devonshire, and there are hundreds of pages of these things, whether they were real or not. There's a really nice section in one of the other chapters where it talks about a fellow of infinite jest. What I really like about this is it captures, I think, the value that was placed on joking as an aspect of Victorian culture and sociability. So in this quote, we can see, there are very few literary persons in London, at least among those connected with the public press, who have not occasionally enjoyed the pleasant punning conversational powers of my friend W.R.V., whose whim, wit, and great good nature are not more esteemed than his unaffected manners and sincerity of disposition justly entitle him to kind of long-winded compliment. But it captures that importance of jokes as part of kind of the social, I suppose the sociability of the sort of Victorian literary circles. In fact, if we go back to one of those pages from before, you can kind of see the way in which these jokes were meant to be enjoyed around the dinner table. Here we have literally a punch bowl filled with Mr. Punch as well. And in fact, this idea, it sort of reminds us, as I said before, that jokes are not things that were to be enjoyed in silence or to be read necessarily in a book, but to be told, to be shared with people. In fact, we've got some more examples of this here. This is from, this is fast forwarding 50 years to the Railway Book of Fun, which, as you can see from its front page, was designed to be bought at a railway station, shared with your friends, maybe inflicted on your fellow passengers, depending whether they wanted it or not. And again, what I like about these books always have introductions where they sort of justify why they exist. And in this one, cheerfulness is defined as a Christian duty and an essential part of good health. If you wanted to be healthy in mind, body, and spirit, you should tell jokes. That's what this book is telling you. As I said, what I really like about it as well is it captures this idea that jokes are meant to be portable, to be shared. In fact, I've got another example here. The wallet of wit, which is literally a wallet of wit, it is in my waistcoat pocket. It is small enough to be able to carry around and to crack jokes from whoever might be passing by. So let me flick there, see if I can find one. Oh God, this is not necessarily a funny one. We could be here forever, couldn't we? Oh God, I should have prepared something rather than just flicking through randomly. A lot of it's kind of worse. Okay, here we go. The author who speaks about his own books is almost as bad as a mother who talks about her own children. So it's not the best thing to do when I talk about my own project for 40 minutes, is it? But what I like about this is it literally fits in my waistcoat pocket. You can carry it around with you, a wallet of wit at your disposal, whenever you might need it. And again, we can kind of see more examples of this, about how jokes were meant to be used. This is a review from, it's an extraordinary book. You can get this on the Internet Archive if you want. It's called Puniana, or Thoughts Wise and Otherwise. Was evidently successful enough to inspire a sequel called More Puniana, which is just, it's about 400 pages of terrible, terrible puns. If you just put Puniana into the Internet Archive, you'll be able to find it. But in a review of it for the Morning Post, it kind of captured why this book would be used. And it said, the most fitting place for this book is in the hands of the young gentleman who has undertaken to amuse an assembled party brought together for the purpose of spending a pleasant evening. It's a kind of form of entertainment to use on your friends. And again, if we kind of just want to capture the importance of this, there's another really nice extract I found here. Actually, well, I didn't find this. This was passed on to me by the press historian Andrew Hobbs, who found it. And because I do stuff on Victorian jokes, I think, oh, I thought Bob would like this. What I really like about it, it is a joke itself. It is a joke about people who steal jokes. And it's a kind of comic set of regulations for an imagined joke copyright protection company. Which is kind of interesting. On Twitter right now, there's a lot of debates about people stealing jokes, ripping each other off, retweeting or taking out people's names. This is a kind of Victorian solution to that problem, where it complains that it has been the custom of certain individuals frequently encountered in society who are desirous of being called droll dogs, smart fellows, capital company, funny creatures, agreeable rattlers, wags, and similar appellations, to maintain their reputations by pilfering the jokes of other people and thus trade on false capital. I love this last phrase, false capital. If jokes are a kind of conversational capital, particularly if you invent your own, it is a sort of resource to be spent on improving your sort of relationships with people. So all of this, the reason I'm sort of stressing all of this, is that I think it kind of captures that far from being humorless, dour, and not at all interested in joking, we see that jokes were important to Victorians, that they did use them, it was an important part of conversation. And just because they didn't necessarily preserve them, just because they're ephemeral, doesn't mean they're not important. I think that's the case of a lot of forms of ephemeral culture. Just because they're thrown away, it doesn't mean for that one moment they weren't significant. I think jokes in particular are a good example of this, but there's tons of others. We treat them like light bulbs, right? They burn brightly for a bit and they're useful for that moment. But once they burn out, we throw them away. We don't think of archiving. We don't think of saving them. And jokes, I think, have fallen victim to that. They've been forgotten, but in the moment, they were important. And that's part of their power, right? They're very much tied to us, a particular moment, and why historians might find them useful. So we sort of, hopefully, I've set up the fact that the Victorians thought jokes were important, funny, worthwhile. The question actually for historians then is, what are we going to do with them? Or for modern audiences more broadly, what significance do these texts have? And as James sort of alluded to in his intro, it's fair to say they've not necessarily aged well. I'm not saying we're going to sort of uncover millions for millions of the greatest jokes ever written in these archives. And in fact, just to give you an example of this, I've got a page here from Puniana, this incredibly torturous book of puns. And if any of you can see, there are some terrible jokes here. I'm going to highlight just one, just because I think it's one of the worst here and also one of the most interesting. And it's down, sorry, this is the cover of Puniana. Down at this one here. And actually, I'm going to test the people in the room on this and see if they can figure out why it was meant to be funny. Let me read it out for those of you if you can't see it. Why is Lord Overstone like a Britannia metal teapot? Because he's a Lloyd with lots of tin. complete silence in the room. There is no kind of barrels of laughter going on. Is anybody sort of immediately thinking, "No, I get it, but it's not great"? You get some people. So, okay. When I sort of tried this on the last audience, people just sort of, I have no idea what this is. If you're still trying to figure it out at home, let me show you some clues. This is a Britannia metal teapot. This is Lloyd Samuel Jones. Lloyd, or this is rather Lord Overstone, and he was a banker. So in other words, his name is Lloyd. He has lots of money, i.e. tin, which makes him like a Britannia metal teapot, which were made by alloying tin. It is an incredibly laboured joke, and it only works if you know who this Lord Overstone is, if you know how Britannia metal teapots are made, if you're aware of the slang at the time. For modern audiences, you're not going to see Jimmy Carr go up on stage at the live at the Apollo and tell this joke. It will not work. But for a historian, because it's embedded with so many of these reference points, things that people at the time were expected to know, to get like that instantly. I know how teapots are made. I know who this guy is. I know he's rich. I think it kind of reveals something. It certainly reveals the fact that Lloyd was supposedly famous enough of a cultural reference point to be kind of the go-to guy to talk about somebody who had lots of money. And this is one joke in amongst 1,000. You can kind of do interesting things with them. It's worth stressing as well that this is not, we can't read too much into one joke published in an obscure collection. But I did some digital searching. This is one of the great things about digital archives now, is the way they allow us to link content in often rather different places. And I started searching for this joke. I thought, I wonder if anybody else told it. And it turns out they did. So first things first, apparently, and this is only using digital archives, this is a partial picture, of course, as always, we're not going to get everything. But apparently, in March 1859, it was told at one of the dinners that were thrown by the people who worked and contributed to Punch. Apparently, Thackeray laughed heartily, according to the memoirs of somebody who was there, who remembered the joke as well, and years later jotted it down as something that was told around the dinner table. Pretty soon after, it was reprinted in a whole range of newspapers. The North Wales Chronicle, the Hampshire Advertiser, the Family Herald, the Leeds Times, the Manchester Times, the Cheshire Observer, the Leeds Intelligentsia, Barrow's Worcester Journal, the Westmoreland Gazette, Berkshire Chronicle, the Hereford Times, Belfast Newsletter, all within the space of a month. This joke goes viral in some kind of way. And it kind of keeps going. A few years later, 1863, it appears out of nowhere in the Sherborne Mercury and in a collection of riddles and jokes collected by the editor of Every Boys magazine. In 1867, so we're talking good 7 or 8 years after it's initially told, it appears in that book I showed you in Puniana. So he's actually ripped it off. He hasn't, the editor hasn't actually written this pun himself. And it also appears then again in the Bedfordshire Times and Independent. In 1870, it goes up from surfaces again, suddenly out of nowhere. It appears in Judy, which is great rivals of Punch, the Belfast Newsletter, the Lancaster Gazette, Lloyd's Weekly, the most popular paper of its time, the Cardiff and Merthyr Guardian, a little bit less popular, and Jackson's Oxford Journal. And then in Canada, in the Huron Expositor and the Hamilton Spectator, and finally, 25 years later, after its initial publication, it ends up in Australia. So we have here a joke that is, on the surface, incredibly bad, a torture pun, appearing in all sorts of places. And each time it appears, an editor is making a decision. They're thinking, oh, I like this joke. My readers might like this joke. We're going to publish it. And it tells us certainly that Lord Overstone remains current around the world as a reference point for 20, 30 years. Now, I'm not writing a biography of Lord Overstone, but if I was, this would be interesting to me. This would be the kind of thing where I think, well, this is a kind of interesting case study to see how a man's reputation is constructed and discussed in unexpected ways. So, hopefully what I've tried to do in this kind of introductory bit, this sort of historical section, is to try and think about the ways in which historians might use jokes, why they might be significant. I think it's worth just kind of doing a quick overview here. Humour, more generally, I think is a really great subject for historians, and it's been, plenty of historians and literary critics have explored it. But the dynamics of laughter, the things we laugh at, the people we laugh at, the reasons why we laugh at them, and the power relations that are sort of reinforced or challenged within those jokes are significant. They're interesting. They're things that historians can get a lot of material out of. Certainly, many of these jokes that are reprinted, that are published in the most popular papers in the country, they do give us access to popular attitudes and ideas. If only because sometimes in a joke, these ideas have been subverted. People are coming in with an expectation of how a mother-in-law will act, or how a priest is supposed to act. The joke will either reinforce that or challenge it. And they give us access to those little things, little fragments. Language and culture is always very sort of well represented in these jokes. And you get a lot of slang, you get a lot of dialect, you get a lot of characters speaking, characters who are supposed to capture a certain class or profession, being captured in their language. Again, very interesting. And finally, for me, as a sort of historian of media and newspapers, they also really allow us to map media networks of reprinting and of exchange, because they are meant to go viral. They are designed to be clipped, reprinted. They're uniquely good at that. And unlike news, which of course loses its value in a few days, in a week, a lot of these jokes, because they're not entirely topical, kind of drift around for a while, and we can use them to kind of track the way in which ideas and print moves physically. And finally, as I've tried to prove this in some of my other research and indeed in this intro, they do have a historical significance, a significance to the people at the time. And if nothing else, that should mean that historians find something to do with them. So that's why we should study Victorian jokes, at least why I think it's worth doing. The next question then is, how are we going to do it? And what are the challenges of doing this kind of work? And I think it's fair to say, before I carry on, I'm not suggesting here that no historian has ever studied Victorian humour. There's plenty of great work done on various forms of Victorian comedy, Victorian literary humour. Generally, I'm speaking in very general terms here, but the bulk of it has focused on a relatively small literary canon of great sort of literary humourists. So Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat, my favourite books. It's great. It's been studied to death. Dickens, of course, is a great humorist in his own right. The quips of Oscar Wilde, or indeed of Mark Twain, and of course Punch. Punch is the kind of often the voice of Victorian humour. And yet, actually, when you look at a lot of work on Punch, again, I'm speaking in general terms now, there are exceptions to this rule, but a lot of it focuses on the images, on the great sort of woodcuts that would be make its reputation. You look at Punch; it is filled with one-liners and little jokes. They always get ignored. People go straight for the cartoons, for the images. That's kind of what made the magazine iconic. Those are the things that now appear in sixth form history textbooks, not the gags that surrounded them. There are some notable exceptions to this. The people have explored popular humour. Roger Savinson's done some great stuff on Ali Sloper, the Victorian comic. There is this particularly great book I would draw your attention to called The Victorian Clown by Jackie Bretton and Anne Featherstone that includes the joke books of the Victorian clown, in the back that were discovered. So you actually see, his personal joke books and the kind of jokes he used as part of his act. This is a great example of when that really, the oral culture of jokes has been captured very fortunately for us. I recommend that heartily. It's a terrific book. But there was a lot of media attention that surrounded this book when it was launched, and deservedly so. But the sort of the excitement was that, my God, we found a few hundred Victorian jokes as if they were these treasure things. You go into the British Library or into its digital archives, there are millions of them, absolutely millions. So this is just very much the tip of the iceberg. So the question then that I want to really tackle for the rest of this presentation is, if Victorian jokes exist in great numbers, and there are millions of them, if they're fairly easy to find, you can't open a popular newspaper at the time without running into them, why haven't historians looked at them? Why have we neglected them? And I think partly, as I said, it's to do with reputation, but there is another reason, and it's to do with these things, with archives, with the structure of archives and how we organise material. And I'm not saying anything new here. I mean, there's been a lot of terrific work done on the theorisation of archives, but I think just at a general level, it's worth sort of reminding ourselves that archives play an enormous role in mediating our relationship with the past. They give shape to the past in interesting ways. They draw boundaries between certain areas, between certain collections, based on things that are included, things that are excluded. And their design, whether it's physical archives like this or digital archives, shapes the way we move around them, the way we access information, the way we miss other forms of information. And the structure of archives, I think, encourages us to access the past in particular ways. In the case of a library like this, it'll be browsing perhaps by the name of the author or the title of a book, by the genre of a book if we're lucky. There will certainly be no way of browsing this archive that says, right, show me all the jokes. They're not built into the structure of the archive. They were never designed in that way. And I suppose what I'm interested in at the moment is thinking, well, these structures are great. They exist for a reason. They were one good way of making sense of an enormous amount of information and of providing those pathways to help people find content. But do we have to stick with these structures? Are there ways we could turn these structures on their head and find new ways of thinking about archives, of organising them, that allow us to do new things, to access forms of culture that were marginal or ephemeral, captured by accident in the margins of other texts? It's worth remembering, even though digital archives have done a lot to destabilise these old structures, they still have their own structures, their own ways of their metadata, their own ways of encouraging us to access them and explore them. And while that's great in some cases, in other points, I think it poses some problems, and that's kind of what I want to talk about now. So let's go back to this terrible joke about Lloyd Overstone that we deconstructed earlier. Now imagine that we wanted to find this joke. If we were going to sort of try and find some examples, as I did, what we might do. Now, under a conventional archive, so before digitisation, this thing, you would have to access this in what might be termed a sort of top-down model, where generally, if you're looking for content in a newspaper, you select a title, you think, oh, right, okay, I'm going to look in the Times, or I'm going to look in Lloyd's Weekly. And that's the sort of first point we say, and then we'd go to Colindale or wherever and we would order it. Then we'd have to think, okay, what issue number are we going to go for? Now, if we were looking for a particular event, if we're looking at the sinking of the Titanic, we know there is a particular date on which we're likely to find newspaper coverage. A joke like that, not a clue where we would start. Then, within an issue, we would kind of think, okay, well, let's try and find the headers. We're not going to read an entire issue of the Times. I did a word count on an issue of the Times from the 1840s the other day. 200,000 words in a single issue of the Times. So 2 to 3 PhD theses published every day at the Office of the Times. We're not going to read through that every time we want to find a single joke. And eventually, after all of that process of kind of working our way down, we eventually end up in an article, an article that we hope is going to be the right one. Chances are it won't be. We move on to the next one. And this sort of top-down process eventually leads us to a single article. Now, what digitization, of course, has done, as we all know, is turn this structure on its head. And now, keyword searching allows us to access article text directly. We no longer have to browse through these structures. We can just search everything at once, which is great. So certainly, the search I did to find this joke and track it around the world was, you can't put the full joke on the OCR error will mean that you miss it. So I just searched for the phrase, why is Lord Overstone? It turns out that wasn't a very well-used phrase, apart from in this joke. And eventually I was able to find, dotted around various archives, examples of this joke. Fine. And, digital archives allowed me to do this. Imagine if I was doing it the other way, I would have to travel to archives all around the world, Canada, Australia, America, the British Library, leaf through every periodic about Lord Overstone here. It would be a life's work for absolutely no good reason. Digital archives have transformed that. But imagine we didn't have this joke. Let's say that we didn't have this starting point, as I did, by finding it in Pune. What if instead we just wanted to find jokes about bankers? It's interesting now, people are cracking a lot of jokes about bankers in the wake of the crisis. I think there's quite an interesting article to be written, and perhaps not by me, but by somebody else. I don't have time for this one, but about the history of joking about bankers and how that sort of works. Where would we start? Well, if we didn't have the keywords, the joke text itself, suddenly things become very, very difficult. If we're going to search for phrases like banking, banker, money, those kind of general terms in the British newspaper archive, well, we kind of know what's going to happen, right? You're going to get masses upon masses of results. You're just going to see them in financial columns, in news columns, in serialized fiction, the lot. There's going to be far too much. Within that, there will be some jokes scattered around in amongst millions, thousands of other texts. It's a problem. We can maybe improve our search a bit by searching for articles with the titles which have words like jokes, wit, humor, jest. This is where I did my own research, and that works up to a point. It cuts out a lot of the sort of noise, but inevitably you also lose a lot of other stuff because not all jokes are published in columns with these titles. So you have this constant. The sort of point I'm trying to make here is you're constantly fighting against the weight of an archive when you're doing this kind of searching. So much of your searching of your keywords is to do with excluding content, but not trying to exclude too much. It's a really difficult balance, and I think it poses some problems when we're dealing with these enormous collections. It's worth sort of, I think, at this point, just reminding ourselves, that particularly newspapers, that are extraordinarily varied texts. Martin Conboy, the press historian, uses the term heteroglossia, or multiple voices, to describe newspapers and the way they're written. And I think he's absolutely right. These are 2 pages from the Hampshire Telegraph and Sussex Chronicle from 1890, page 11 and 12, so towards the back of the paper. Just look at the different content that is in here. We have jokes, first things first, and interestingly, multiple joke columns scattered around. They're not, ordered into one simple part of the paper. We also have poetry scattered around, fiction over here, some gossip over here, the children's column here, letters here, and interestingly, these overlap, right? So within the children's column, there are poetry and letters. So these things require multiple ways of categorization. There are recipes over here, there are book reviews down there, and the rest of it, I can't even categorize. It's kind of miscellaneous in human interest. We have a guide to kissing for beginners over here. We have stories about honeymoons over here. Days of grog. These are tales from retired sailors. Extraordinary range of stuff. All archives are like this. Newspapers just kind of heighten it by putting it all on the same page. And it's worth sort of remembering that each of these texts is produced in different ways, written by different people, coming from different kind of literary traditions or working practices. They are different texts, and after they are gathered in this moment on this one day, a lot of them have a second life. They get clipped out, they get exchanged, some get discarded. Some of them have a life before they arrived here. They're gathered here in this one moment, but they are independent things, newspaper articles. Well, united in the newspaper, but independent in their own kind of way. And if we were building digital archives for each of these pieces of content, as we might well do, an archive of newspaper poetry, an archive of recipe columns, an archive of serialized fiction, would be great. We would have completely different metadata for all of them. They would not be organized using the same categories. Which is what we do now. They've been built into a newspaper, into an archive, which has tried to think of a way of organizing all of this content in all of its disparate and eclectic forms with the same metadata categories. And that's problematic. So imagine we've got a joke here. It's not a particularly good one. It's titled A Useful Present. Mrs. Henry Peck, whose mother has been visiting them for over 4 months, says, "I don't know what to buy mother for a Christmas present, do you?" To which her husband replies, "Yes, buy her a travelling bag." So, good Victorian mother-in-law joke. Interestingly, this doesn't include the word mother-in-law. So if you're actually searching for it using a keyword search, you would not find it. You would have to search for mother and immediately think about all the other things you would find there. But what if we had metadata for it? Think about all the different categories we could have. Some of them would be about the source type, the source location. But then you might think about things like the title of the joke, the publication to which it was attributed, its author if we knew the format of the joke. Wouldn't it be nice if we could sort of search for puns or conversations or comic definitions and separate them out? We might talk about the nationality where it's published. This was an American joke. And we might also start thinking about characters and their qualities. What if we had metadata for each character? This is the metadata that exists within the archive. Everything else is something that we would have to add. But yeah, what if we had ones for characters? So what if we had for Mrs. Henry Peck, we could know that her gender was female, that she was identified in this text as both a wife and a daughter, that she's an adult. If in other jokes we had other things about maybe their class, the emotion they're expressing, their appearance, the same for her husband, that would suddenly allow us to explore this archive in some really interesting new ways. We could just search for all the mother-in-law jokes that feature, middle-class women or working-class women, if we had that information. I think a good example of this, this is not a new, this idea of, adding metadata to things to make them more discoverable is nothing new, right? A great example of this is the database of mid-Victorian illustration, which is one of my favorite archives just to idly browse through. And as you can kind of see down the left here, that's an extraordinary range of metadata. You can search for, in this case, I've gone for people relationships, family relationships, in-laws. So this is a way of browsing to, images about your in-laws. But you can also, sort of filter this and say, well, show me images that are outside and that feature a working class man sitting on a stool or something like that. It's extraordinary levels of data on there. In fact, there's one of these, going back to the comic formats I showed you before, that works well for that joke we had. I don't know what to buy mother for a Christmas present, do you? And the desperate man replies, yes, buy her a travelling bag, clearly exhausted by his mother-in-law staying for far too long. But we found that, the great thing about this is that images, as you well know, are incredibly difficult to find using search engines because they're not text-based. And metadata, is useful because it describes sources which cannot describe themselves or which cannot describe them using our sort of conventional processing software. And even though jokes are textual, we could apply very much a similar process of annotating them or adding this additional metadata to make them more discoverable and to improve the ways we could interrogate those data sets through either close or distant reading. So, going back to that newspaper page, imagine then instead of dealing with the entire archive in all of this sort of forms and constantly having to battle with the weight of it, imagine instead if we could simply look at the jokes. And not just the jokes from one archive, from one newspaper, but all of them from wherever they might be. There we go. Hey. So this is what I sort of set up starting to do. Now, before I sort of carry on, there's an important sort of side point I want to make here because it's something that occasionally comes up in questions and I kind of want to address. A historian sort of saying strip text from its context and don't care about the things that it was published around. I'm aware that that could be slightly sort of a controversial thing to say. Particularly as a press historian, I'm constantly moaning about historians cherry picking from newspapers and not caring about what's around them. And I'm sort of aware that that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm saying let's strip jokes from their books, the newspapers in which they're originally published, and look at them in isolation. I think we need to do that in order to be able to analyse them, to sort of remove them from the noise. But any archive that I would create with this would have a very clear way of linking these jokes back to where they were originally published. And ideally, if all archives were open access and not behind paywalls, it would be simply a button that says, show me where this was originally published. It's a bit more complicated than that, as you know. So I think there was a real sort of balance here of making sure you keep the context, but also not allowing that additional context, all that additional material to weigh you down to impede your analysis. And, as historians, it's something we have to be careful about, but I think we shouldn't be too nervous about doing it either. So this is what I'm thinking about then. My goal at the end of all this is to have a really high quality annotated research archive of 1 million Victorian jokes, let's say, and that's the high end. So I'd be happy with 100,000, but I'm aiming high. So that's what I'm aiming at doing, and that's the position that I sort of was at when I went to the British Library. I wanted to find a way of creating a data set, an archive that I could use that would be free for other people to use, to interrogate using whatever digital or standard sort of research means they would wish to use. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we take stuff that has already been digitized, that exists in archives, and remix it, create new archives from existing content? And I don't really have an answer for this. I've sort of been thinking about this for a while. This project is still very much ongoing. The British Library part of it, I should say, finished sort of earlier this year. Edge Hill, my university, have funded the further development of the project, so we're working on it now. But it's a kind of slow burn at the moment. So I'm certainly not coming today and saying, look at how we've solved all these incredible challenges that everybody faces with digital archives. I'm just kind of setting up some of the things that I've been thinking about, and actually kind of throwing the ideas out here and saying, can you fix these problems? Do you know the solutions here? So let's think about some of these challenges. The first one, actually, The challenge we normally get with creating a digital archive is that we have to scan stuff. We have to, find books like this and find ways of photographing them, scanning them, preserving them. The great thing about remixing is you don't have to do that unless you want to. They've already been digitized. This is a new way of creating an archive. It's not starting from the ground up by going into a shelf and grabbing loads of books. It is saying, right, we've spent time, we've spent money, enormous amounts of money in some cases, digitizing things. Let's start to reuse them. Let's think about new ways we can use that content. So actually, I may well digitize some of my own joke books from my collection, but by and large, I'm interested in using ones that have already been created and held currently by the British Library. So the actual challenge then is not digitizing things from scratch, it's figuring out how do we get them out of existing archives. And this is tricky. The first barrier, of course, as you all have figured out by now, is actually getting access to this data and getting the right to do what we want with it, to actually remix. There's the same things that obviously anybody else doing any kind of remixing, DJs, artists have the same problem. Do they have permission to reuse this content? And this is tricky, and it's worth sort of stressing that, of course, the way in which we might get access to these things is going to differ for every archive. So I'm talking here about using multiple collections of newspapers, magazines, books. Every single one of them is going to pose a different kind of problem here. And I mean, I should say that I've been quite fortunate that that Gale and DC Thompson have given me permission to use their content from the newspaper archives. So in a sense, that hurdle isn't there. But I just want to say, that this is, I imagine, a theme that comes up a lot in discussions around digital history. I don't want to sort of turn this into a moaning rant about copyright, but this is one of those moments where increasingly I start to realize the problems this poses and the barriers it poses for our research. Because it used to be, before I started thinking about these kind of projects, that I felt that my work was limited by what we might say, by what was possible, by the things that I could find, by the methodologies I could use. Increasingly, it feels like my research is limited by what's permissible, particularly by digitization companies deciding whether I can access the data, whether I can republish it, whether I can use it in other ways. And even when they say yes, and I should say that every time I've worked with professional commercial publishers, they've been enthusiastic, supportive, great, wonderful, and I can't fault the way that they've worked with me. But still, the fact that we had to get that permission, I think, poses some quite important philosophical problems for our research. If we're having to limit the way we do things by what is permissible rather than what is possible, I think we run the risk of maybe missing out on some really interesting work. And so this is sort of an issue that I'm sort of running up against at the moment, and I think we all are working in the digital humanities, and it's not necessarily something I've got a solution for, but certainly, the kind of the work that's been done on open access academic publishing now, I really hope we're going to see that movement extended to archives in well, as much as we possibly can. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. Data format is another thing. Technically, from a sort of practical point of view, every single digital archive that I've tried to work with is organized in a different way. They use different sort of ways of formatting their XML, different sort of structures in which their data is stored. Sometimes even getting access to it in a format that is usable is very, very difficult. So again, there are challenges here, and particularly this is going to be the case for any remixing project. You're going to have to work with different data sets and make them talk to each other, which is problematic. So then the question is, okay, if we're going to sort of extract things from existing archives, are we going to find a way to do this automatically, develop some kind of script that pulls things out? We have to manually go in and say, yep, I'll have that, and pull it out. And this is sort of the thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently. When I initially pitched this project to the British Library, I naively thought that I could just go to them and say, give me everything that has the title jokes in the title column, and they would just kind of type on a computer and it would just be pulled out. And that potentially could still happen, though we had troubles at the time getting full access to the data set. If we look at 19th century British newspapers, which is the kind of main data set I'm working with at the moment, you can kind of see that actually it does have a specific title field. It breaks newspapers down into individual articles. They have titles. And what that means is that actually, because a lot of jokes were published in dedicated columns, if we find the title of that column, we should be able to identify and isolate them fairly well. And this is a sort of look at the XML for this is the Daily Mail archive actually, but you can see there is a title field there. So it should be possible to index this and to pull things out. And when I get access to this data set in the way I need it, that's hopefully what we're going to do. But then there are problems, because Victorian newspaper editors were a great fan of novelty, and just describing their joke columns as jokes was evidently not enough for them. And certainly in this case, the Hampshire Telegraph, one of my favourite papers, decided every week to change the name of its joke column, which from a point of view of sort of extracting it is a bloody pain. So this is its column of imported American jokes. It goes from being called, well, Book Wheat Cakes. I mean, if you saw that issue, you think that's a recipe column, right? But you go in and you find it's browned on beach, these are browned on a Yankee griddle, hot from a Yankee fires. There are different ones every time. And so, at that point, you start to think, well, we're going to have to do some kind of manual searching here, possibly. The sort of fable solution to this that I really want us to try and find, but maybe beyond us, is to try and build some kind of software that recognizes jokes from in amongst other texts and sort of things, well, that looks like a joke. We can probably pull that out. This is kind of sort of blue sky thinking stuff here. We don't have a way to do this yet. But if you look at this joke here, which is there's a lot of these jokes. Oh no, this is a different one. Okay, an unpremeditated denouement. Bob Bunkum, an actor. Failure. I should think it was. Why the whole play was ruined. The host says, "How was that?" He replies, "Why, at the end of the last set, a steam pipe burst and hissed me off the stage." Now, not a particularly good joke, but I picked this one because it shows you the structure that these jokes often use. You have a title in capital letters, which is indented there. Then you have characters, names which are often capitalized, followed by a description in brackets and a colon. There are common structures here and then an attribution at the end. It might be possible to sort of train, once we've re-OCR'd joke columns, or indeed OCR'd an entire newspaper data set, to look for these common features and try and pick them out. We're sort of working on that. It's still a long way down the line. I don't want to sort of promise that we're going to find a way like a magic joke detection tool. But I think it's one of the kind of bigger problems that actually a lot of us would be interested in solving. How do you extract certain forms of text from a wider archive? And if anybody's got any sort of bright ideas on how to do that, wants to have a go at it, let me know. So I think the automatic route is great. It would be nice. It would allow us to sort of do this at a much greater rate. For now, at the moment, I'm literally just going in, right-clicking, downloading joke columns and processing them myself, which is not going to, I'm not going to get to 1 million jokes that way. Otherwise, I will go mad. But we'll get to a few thousand. So let's say you've got them. Let's say you pull these jokes out of existing collections. Then the next challenge is actually how do you integrate them into a new collection? How do you convert things that are in different file formats, different sort of structures, into a new structure based around, in this case, jokes, but it could be anything. So again, data format's an issue. For us, one of the biggest problems actually is image segmentation, is actually taking a joke column or a joke book and breaking it down into individual jokes and trying to do that automatically. At the moment, again, I'm doing this manually just by slicing open Photoshop. But again, that is not a sustainable way to build a massive archive. You can see this is a classic joke column. And again, if we kind of separate these out, but you can see there are individual jokes in there. And again, I think it's possible using these indentations and some of the text formatting to train something that will actually recognize the format of these. Though, of course, this is just one joke column in one newspaper. Might we have to train it for every type of newspaper? That's where it becomes very, very tricky. Creating sort of solutions for very, very small problems that need to be replicated in different ways is very tricky. So we need to sort of figure out a way to do that. Initially, when we first started doing this with the British Library, we had users transcribe the entire column and divide it themselves, which might be what we have to do. But the sort of response we got from that was that people found transcribing an entire column of 30 or 40 jokes, maybe take 20 minutes, half an hour. They found that a little bit laborious, and they would prefer just to do one joke at a time. So if we're trying to motivate people to do this work, as I'll talk about in a minute, then we need to sort of deal with them individually. So finally, this is sort of getting on to the slightly more, the stuff that I'm working on at the moment. I should say that those two bits of the project are sort of on hold at the moment. And this is the bit that we've got funding for from Edge at the moment, which is about annotating jokes and processing them. I'm sort of maybe naively saying, we'll figure out a way to get them somehow. And we kind of, I think we will. So once we've done that, how do we make these jokes readable? How do we improve them? The first and obvious step would be to OCR them. And it's worth sort of reminding, I think as many of you will know, that OCR is not all OCR programs are created equally. And these are some samples that we did using free apps or our university's own scanners, and then there's some more professional Abbey Fine Reader over here. These are completely unusable. Clearly, that's not, we can never sort of make sense of that. Abbey's pretty good. This is using a fairly good clean text. It's been expanded a little bit there, but this is about as good as it gets in terms of the quality of the text for us. And you can see here that with Abbey, it's done all right. It's got some little mistakes, the kind of the little leftovers from the segmentation thing caused problems down here. Here we have an exclamation point mistaken for an L, so there's a few little things there. But by and large, it's usable, so we'll definitely do it. We'll certainly make these texts searchable using OCR. But for the kind of things we want to do, which is sort of remixing them, republishing them in interesting ways, we need as far as possible to get to a point where the transcriptions are perfect or near enough. This is a good example, actually, of how Abbey falls down. One of the really frustrating things about joke columns is they are often the last column on a page, which means that you get these little bits here where they're bent. And here you can see it's got all sorts of slightly confusing characters being added to it. So OCR is useful, and in newspapers, of course, we accept these errors because we're dealing with an enormous amount of text that could never be processed, or probably won't be processed in other ways. I know there are some newspaper collections that are doing extraordinary work with crowdsourcing, but by and large, we accept this and we say, okay, it's enough for us to do basic searching. But what we need to do, we need something a bit more. So what we did with the British Library was actually just get users to transcribe our columns from scratch. Interestingly, we found that they found it quicker to transcribe from scratch than correcting text, and actually they enjoyed it a bit more as well. We're still kind of experimenting now because we only had a few people doing it, but Ben Osteen at the British Library Labs put together this nice quick system using Omeka and Scripto to kind of just get us off the ground. And we're now building our own bespoke transcription platform at Chill project. So once we've done that, of course, what we then want to figure out how to do is to add all this extra information. Once we've transcribed the joke, we've got its basic text. We want all these additional information about characters, about subjects. This is a mother-in-law joke about Christmas. And there are some ways to do this automatically, to process these texts and to look for particular words, particular structures that might be able to do this automatically. But jokes are complicated, right? How do we train a computer to recognize a pun, to kind of pick up on those incredibly nuanced bits of language? It might be possible to do bits of this automatically, but what became very clear early on is that jokes and a lot of other texts are so complicated, so nuanced, they need the human eye to look at them and to add this information themselves. So the big question, the thing that we're working on right now, is how do you do this? How do you actually motivate people to add this information? How do we collect it? And how do we collect it not just for 10 jokes or 20 jokes, but for potentially thousands of them? The answer, of course, and how do we do it for free, or at least for very, very little money, without sort of sending this off to a transcription company in India, as they do for some of the newspaper archives. And the answer to this, I think, as the answer to a lot of digital projects at the moment, seems to be crowdsourcing, which I think is now being used for all sorts of projects. These are just a few of the ones that kind of I encountered in my own research, but there are tons of other examples. The Dickens Journals Online project transcribed pretty much all of the periodicals that Dickens published, Household Words and all these things, and all year round. They were transcribed by users. That's now fully functional archive. Transcribe Bentham at UCL is another great example of this kind of work. There is, of course, these sort of slightly more flashy projects that the Zooniverse is involved with in citizen science, and then Project Gutenberg as well, which was largely a transcription of it. There are tons of others, and I'm an enormous fan of this kind of work. The big dilemma for anybody running these projects is how do you actually motivate people to do it? How do you gather together volunteers who are going to donate their time to do something for us? And I think the answer is there has got to be something in it for them. And a lot of these other projects have motivated people, quite rightly, by saying you are contributing to a great historical project, you are helping us to create these archives. That's fantastic, and clearly they've had great success doing that. Others have thought a little bit more about more creative ways of gamifying these processes, of creating things like leaderboards, badges that you earn by transcribing. I think there's some evidence that works. I'm a little skeptical about those kind of rewards and how effective they are really motivating people. It might work for some people though. And so this is what we've been thinking about on our project. How might we motivate people to sit down and look at Victorian jokes and actually add all this extra information that we need? And the idea that we're sort of working with is a form of this gamification, but it's I suppose rather than just drawing upon things like leaderboards, scores, badges, all that kind of stuff, we sort of wanted to sort of encourage users to do something a little bit more creative, let's say, and to do something that might be termed, or I think has been termed by Scott Nicholson, I think, meaningful gamification, forms of gamification that encourage people to engage in processes that they find valuable, not just because they get a little reward at the end of it. And this is a mock-up that I'm showing behind me of an interface that we're developing. It probably will look nothing like this. This was just something I created on Photoshop. And the core idea here, this is what I'm working with a colleague Chill on at the moment, is to capture all these annotations during the transcription process, but to do it in a way that users feel is engaging their creativity. So at the moment, what will happen is that they will transcribe a joke will appear up here, they'll transcribe it, and then they will add information, let's say, about characters or locations, and as they're doing it, a cartoon version of the joke will be constructed in front of them. So their decisions, the data they give us, it's sort of reflected in the creation of this image here. And at the end of it, they can tweet it. They can send it out on Twitter. They can share it with their friends. It is a kind of little bit of that social capital that I talked about earlier, of people sort of being given something that they can, a joke that they can tell. And ideally, what we should get to a point where this doesn't seem like a really laborious transcription interface, but where the process of creating the joke or being creative essentially captures the data we need. This is what we're kind of looking for. And I like to call this a form of reciprocal impact. Impact is this word that historians in the UK will be very, very aware of at the moment, where we've been really encouraged to demonstrate the impact of our research to external groups outside of the academy, the media and the public, libraries. And initially when I thought this project, it was very much a one-way kind of conversation. I wanted to convert my jokes into a format that could be shared with other people, and then to sort of send it out into the world and see if they liked it. What this does is a slightly more reciprocal conversation. We allow people to get engaged in the process. They get these images that can be shared on Twitter or on Tumblr or whatever. But in the process, they improve our archive as well. So it's not just saying, we've built something, what are you going to do with it? It's saying, help us build something, get something out of it yourself, be creative, and hopefully at the end of it, they'll have something that they like, that they want to share. and we'll also have an improved archive. So it is, even though those things are quite sort of frivolous and daft, the idea is that by creating them, we end up with a much more rich research platform for us to use. This is still being built. We're still kind of working on how this is all going to function. But hopefully, sometime sort of spring next year, we'll be having sort of versions of this we can start to show people, and people can try it for themselves. So what I've sort of tried to talk about today in this talk has been two forms of remixing. And so first things first, challenging the structures of existing archives, which prioritize certain forms of text, of culture, of objects over others, and instead thinking about how can we remix that? How can we restructure archives in order to make ephemeral texts or marginalized texts a little bit more accessible, and to perhaps create research environments that are designed for a very specific kind of object. I've also talked a little bit about the kind of creative remixing we want to sort of embed in the creation of this archive. I think finally what I want to finish with is actually just to stress that this kind of creativity is not something that needs to be restricted to our platform, the thing we built. I'm really a great believer in just releasing content and letting people do what they want with it, whether it's artistic work, research work, whether it's creating their own archives, remixing the remixed archive. And as an example of that, what we did as part of this project was send a collection of our jokes to an artist, a filmmaker, animator named Rob Walker, who does a great series called the Victorian Cutout Theatre. You can find him on
mother-in-law is animated before a live.
You can find him on Twitter at Timid Weewolf, and he's great. I sent him jokes and just said, do what you want with them, find a way to make them funny. And what he created is this extraordinary animation called My Mother-in-Law, which is kind of I'm trying to think how to describe it. It's like a sort of Victorian version of a 1970s sitcom imagined by Monty Python, which I think is a, kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I'm going to play it now. Those of you watching at home, I think on the slide there should be a link to this you can play on YouTube if you want to see it. I encourage you to check it out. I'm going to play it here for the rest of us.
Studio audience.
That dog of Eliza's across the way bit Mother again this morning, and I want to know what you propose doing about it.
I think I shall buy the dog.
Edwin, dear, Mamma's going. Do say something pleasantly. Edwin, my darling, you know I say goodbye to your mother most pleasantly.
The last time you said goodbye pleasantly to my mother was at her funeral.
Nevertheless,
I shall endeavour to do my best.
This is the last night we shall all be together. Tomorrow I shall be far from here. 60 miles away, isn't it, Abigail?
Oh, 60 miles is quite near enough.
Terribly sorry about the dog fight, Mama. Edwin said he would reprimand Eliza for her negligence. Well, I can't judge her and her mongrel too harshly. She hasn't a husband and must have a brute of some sort to look after.
You insult me in my own home.
Now, Edwin, that's quite impossible. How's that? You live in a rented house. Abigail, before I depart, I must give you this bit of advice. Yes, Mama? Never love a man for money. It's wrong. But never love a man without money. That's just stupid. Good day.
I think he did a pretty good job with that. I mean, given the material he was working with, I think that's a pretty good effort at trying to make things funny. What I really like about that is that it just kind of shows that these jokes don't have to be studied in academic context and saved in the way that we want to use them. I think if we love the things we research, I think there is also something to be said for just letting them out there and letting people reuse them. Victorian jokes at the time, they moved virally, as we saw. They moved around the world. There's no reason why we shouldn't allow them to sort of do that again now and encourage them to be rewritten, reused, reappropriated, as they were indeed in the 19th century. And I like the idea of creating platforms that encourage that creativity. So certainly as part of the Jokes project, where I think we will be encouraging people to create their own versions of jokes, whether it's as comics, whether it's as stand-up sets. I'm desperate to give these to a stand-up comedian and see what can you create a set around these jokes? Can you make them funny again? You find somebody brave enough. So if anybody's watching and fancies having a go at that, get in touch. So we'll find ways of kind of encouraging that and of tracking it. I think it's a sort of interesting way of bringing a neglected form of Victorian culture back to life. We're continually reinventing Shakespeare and Dickens and redoing them, setting them in new kind of ways. Why not do it with jokes as well? Okay, that's pretty much it for me. I mean, I should say that if you found this interesting or you want to sort of read more about it, I've got a sort of text version of pretty much of this talk coming out in the journal 19, Interdisciplinary Studies in the Long 19th Century. That should be coming out pretty soon, I think. So I'll tweet links to that as well. So by all means, take a look at that if you want, if you can stomach these jokes again. If not, you can keep up to date with the project and with what I'm doing on my Twitter feed, which is @digivictorian or at digitalvictorianist.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. I really enjoyed how you moved through, I guess, lots of the themes this seminar tends to cover, from sort of the archive side, the crowdsourcing side, the basic infrastructure side as well. So obviously talking about the research you actually do, how this impacts your research. Before I ask a question, I think I should open it to the room actually, rather than taking the chair's privilege on this occasion. So does anyone want to begin with a question for Bob?
I had one on the crowdsourcing mechanics, which was it's wonderful to have an ambition to do 1,000 jokes in the database, but if do you think people would be tempted to spend more time making the perfect cartoon and less time transcribing, and how would you manage that tension?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think the idea is that we want to build a system so the more time they spend making the perfect cartoon, those decisions will enrich the database, so that whenever they tag an object, let's say in a joke, and then they get an image version to manipulate, that creativity should kind of reward us a bit. I think you're right, there is a tension here that there might be some people who just want to do raw, quick transcribing, who just want to get in there and do the data as quickly as possible. And we'll probably actually make it possible for people to do that without them having to engage with this process if we want. I think the benefit of this is it potentially engages a different kind of audience, right? So I think, in current crowdsourcing projects, you tend to get a sort of relative, not a small group, but a sort of core group of people who are really committed to the idea of the project. I like the idea of embedding this within a kind of more fun process that might draw in other people, largely from the internet. You think about the creativity that is out there on the internet now, people creating their own memes, their own images. It'd be great to kind of capture some of that kind of that energy. I think there's also something to be said for doing this in very sort of small chunks like that, maybe embedding it in an app. I know that some of the family search companies now kind of have transcription apps where you can just do something like kettle boils. I think that's kind of what I want to do with this. It wants to be something that you can do playfully in a small sitting. And if we, I suppose the idea here is if we get enough people to do it, then we won't have the problem of them getting too sidetracked by the fun stuff. It's going to be an interesting tension. And I should say this is really just a way of experimenting this thing. Is this way of crowdsourcing going to work? It might not. We might get 100 people come in, make one joke, think, right, that's enough, and disappear, in which case we'll have to think again. But I think it's worth seeing, just seeing what happens if we kind of encourage people in this slightly different way. But you're right, and the answer is I don't know yet until we send it out there. When we sort of did the initial announcement with the British Library, it got quite a lot of media attention. People seem to like the idea of playing with Victorian jokes in this way. So I'm hoping there's an audience out there, but remains to be seen. So as to how they'll engage with it. But that's part of the project, actually, just to see. It might be that it's a disaster, but we'll see.
Sort of a question about the future. In a sense, actually, what's your 5-year hypothesis about what you can find? So what are we going to understand the Victorian joke differently? And what once you have the kind of corpus that allows you to do kind of work, assume for a minute that all of this goes inundated now. Where's the game?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of the things I don't know, and actually until we get the data, we're not going to really be able to sort of know what we're going to be able to do with it. And part of the problem now is that I spent years working on Victorian jokes in the way I sort of outlined earlier of just searching for them, reading them myself, and not being able to process them using more sort of interesting digital humanities tools. And so at the moment, all I can think of are the things I would like to do with them, not necessarily what I'll find. So certainly I'm interested, there's people who work in linguistics I've spoken to are very interested in isolating dialogue within jokes and sort of creating a corpus of how to explore language. I'm very interested in exploring themes around gender in these jokes. There's an awful lot in these jokes about relationships between husbands and wives. Of course, what we'll be able to do when we have an entire corpus of these jokes is see how things change over time, to track trends. Do mother-in-law jokes become popular at a certain time or not? At the moment, sort of mapping that is too difficult in amongst all that other data. So the answer is actually, I don't know. That's kind of what I'm excited about, getting them into a format where we can interrogate them in the way we do more visible texts, and we'll see what happens. So what I really want actually is to get this out there, to make it publicly available for any researcher who wants to use it, and for them to say, this is what I'm going to do with this data. And it could be some extraordinary things I've never thought about. So for me, it's actually just liberating this data, creating a format we can reuse, and then just exploring it and seeing. I do want to create a Victorian joke book as well. This is the other side of things. It's not going to be a bestseller, but as a stocking filler, I think it'd be quite a fun thing to pull together. We might do that based on the ones that people retweet the most, or something like that. So kind of a way of gauging, if retweeting is kind of a digital version of laughter, then maybe this will be a way of us figuring out which ones we like. So I'm certainly thinking of using it for a lot of my future academic research. The other thing I'm really interested in, as you might have gathered, is reprinting. So I'm interested in tracking how jokes move. And again, we can do that, which is that as they move, they often get rewritten and changed. So if we have the full data set, again, without all the sort of the noise around it, I think we'll be able to track that in some really interesting ways. So I'm hoping it's going to foster a lot of interesting research projects, but I'd hope it could also be used by novelists, by comedians, by anybody who just thinks, oh, let's have a look at this side of the Victorians that we haven't been able to look at before. So the answer is I sort of don't know, but I want to find out. So, but if anybody has any ideas for what they would do with the data set, I'd really like to hear from them as well. So it'd be interesting to see what other ideas are out there. So it's very much a sort of an open project. Anybody who wants to come in and use the data or play with it or help us solve these problems is more than welcome.
I think the stuff on language actually is really interesting.
Yeah.
I can talk to you later about this, but things have been rumbling in my head for a while about sort of pieces of language that exist within databases where you can kind of hide bits off and say, well, it's not definitely speech, but it resembles part of speech, and what can we do with that perhaps doesn't fit naturally against the sort of part of speech archives that we tend to use, which are kind of not formalized language. Perhaps there's a language in humour that's really interesting. The way that sentences begin, particularly in jokes, are really, really interesting. They begin with sort of noisy, nasally words that aren't often actually language, I guess. And there's something in there that I find really fascinating.
You're right, actually, and the great thing about jokes is that I think it makes it quite easy with some of them to figure out which bits are speech, and because they're particularly the conversational jokes that I've shown you there. It should be possible for us to isolate that and then just see. But I suppose it's worth remembering that that kind of speech is a very stylized, often very stereotypical form of speech. It's not necessarily going to be an accurate representation of what an Irishman or a lawyer sounds like, or whatever it would be. But I think it could be really interesting. There's a lot we could do with that amount of data, particularly where you're linking speech to a certain type of character. Lawyer says this, Irishman says that. I think there's quite an interesting about identity and speech we could do with that. So yeah, I'm keen to see, but we need to get the data into a format where we can do it first.
A question from John, and then there's two online, which we'll go on for that.
Great.
Is this actually a subset of Victorian jokes? Because they all come from these sort of filler columns in newspapers. Are there any political current affairs type jokes?
Yeah.
Would there be somewhere else?
They're there as well. I mean, I've only shown you a very sort of small number of examples here. So the main source we're using to sort of play with the prototype at the moment is a column called Jokes of the Day that appeared in Lloyd's Weekly News. And that has a very specific kind of humour in it. It's often those very sort of conversational jokes. Yeah, you can look much wider than that. There are whole other genres. You're right. There are topical jokes. There are sort of longer anecdotes. There are comic definitions, puns. There's a whole range of ones that we're trying to ingest into the archive. There is a sort of point at what point does a joke become an anecdote, and what point does an anecdote become a short story that we're still trying to figure out. Where do we draw the line for this? I mean, I'm inclined to include everything, but including it on a tweet or an image becomes problematic on that. So yeah, when we get the full thing together, there will be a whole range of political jokes. I'm sure your newspapers will be the place to find them as well. There's a lot of topical humour in there as well. And again, for historians, that's just really interesting. A lot of, obviously, the reference points are lost from modern audiences, so it'll be interesting to see how they get reused, if at all. But yeah, there'll be a whole range of jokes. And at the moment, I'm amassing joke books on eBay and finding them in every digital archive I can find. But there'll be a really wide range of stuff, I hope. The challenge then is that every joke has a different format. And then you start thinking, how do we process it? But it's an interesting problem. I should say on that note, as a historian, I'm not a programmer. I'm doing my best to learn this stuff. But actually having to think about how would a machine read a joke is really making me think about their structure in interesting ways. So there's really something to be said about figuring out how can a computer process it that forces me to think about the formats as well. And political ones are going to be interesting to see how we convert them into images or anything, because some of them are just political puns based on a kind of passing news story that happened that week. And that's where it becomes tricky. That's where actually you need to return to the context again and see the newspaper in which it was embedded. But yeah, there'll be a really wide range of stuff, I hope. Something for everybody when it's finished.
Do you want to go to the stream?
So I've only got one. Let me see.
There's one on the stream. There's one on the Twitter.
Okay, so here's one from Twitter. This is Adam Crimble.
Oh, right.
So his question is, what do serious, in inverted commas, scholars think about all of this remixing joke stuff? Are you ruffling any Victorians' feathers as you're doing this?
I don't know if the feathers have been ruffled. They haven't told me about it. I don't know, possibly. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk today to set up the whys, that I think initially when I started talking about this, it was very sort of playful and slightly kind of frivolous. And I think I needed to make a stronger case for why this was good research. But I think ultimately, as Victorianists, I think jokes are as plausible a subject as anything, right? As newspapers, as books, as any source we might look at. And sometimes they give us things that those sources can't. So I think that the aims of the project, which is to create a proper, serious research archive, I would hope that the Victorians they don't have to like the memes and the images, I guess, but I think it's a means to an end. I like that as well. I think it's a fun way of doing it. It'll be interesting to see. I'd be interested to know if people aren't sold on the project, which bits they're not. convinced by. So if there is anybody, then let me know. I will never be offended by that, because it is odd, I know. Particularly because when we initially proposed this, the goal was make Victorian jokes funny again, which I'm not sure is necessarily what as researchers were trying to do. It was an interesting kind of problem. For me, I just want access to them. I just want to be able to explore them and interrogate them and produce good, refable research, with it.
Okay, the question from the stream is from Melanie Beals, and she asks, what do you feel are the relative benefits of crowdsourced metadata versus a unified glossary of keywords and tags, such as one created by archivists rather than users?
Yeah, I think we sort of want to try and do both with this, which is to say that we want to create sort of a way of automatically of tagging in-house that will lead users to creating good tags. I mean, with all these things, any kind of crowdsourcing project, as people know, you've always got that balance between, are they going to produce good quality annotations, good quality transcriptions? Are there going to be problems with that? It's the kind of deal you make with this, isn't it? You accept that you're not necessarily going to get perfect data from it. I think, for me, it's a purely practical point of view, which is to say that I don't think we have the resources or the ability to actually get a team of archivists to do this methodically. I certainly don't want to categorize 1 million Victorian jokes myself. So there is that problem of figuring out, how are we going to keep this consistent? Are users going to recognize a conversational joke? Are they going to know it's a conversation and not a pun? We're going to have to think really carefully when we do this about guiding users to those conclusions and perhaps making suggestions to them based on things we've scanned. I think you're right. It's a problem with this. What I hope we'll be able to do when we create the archive and users actually use it is that in the search interface there'll be a way of selecting which data set and which metadata you search. So you might be able to search the raw OCR. You might be able to say, right, show me transcribed text. You might be able to say, right, show me user metadata. And we may even have sort of metadata generated by expert users who have been trained that we have people use. But I think with these kind of projects, which are not backed by thousands or millions of pounds, there's a few thousand pounds now, but not masses of money, we need to find ways of doing this. And I think, unfortunately, it sounds rather exploitative, but encouraging other people to get involved, even if they don't have the expertise, I think is the only solution for it. But it's going to be an interesting problem. And actually what we're doing at the moment, bit by bit, is expanding our transcription, our user base, to actually see what kind of errors or different styles they bring in. We don't really know how that's going to turn out yet, but it's something we're aware of. And I think, I suppose the sort of broader point with the idea of remixing is there's no reason why we can't have both, right? There's no reason why we can't say, let's introduce a whole new sort of module of metadata that's been produced by experts when we can do it. The whole idea is we should be able to switch these things in and out whenever we want. But again, it's just about how do we create them practically. I think crowdsourcing is the way to go, but we'll see. It might be that the data that we get given by users is unusable. We'll have to see. We won't know until we do it.
I guess going back to your point about encouraging creativity, that's sort of constraining there's a relationship there between constraining too much and whether people have fun, right? So yeah,
it's true. And one of the things we're worried about, I mean, the scenario here is like, we release this and then 4chan or Reddit says, all right, let's go and pile in here, and they produce absolutely horrendously offensive and terrible kind of jokes that completely destroy or have nothing to do with metadata. We're going to have to find ways of policing that, as all crowdsourcing projects do. We're also going to try and find ways of capturing the essential metadata quickly before we encourage the sort of more playfulness. So hopefully we'll get the kind of good basic data, and then everything after that will be sort of like an added extra. But that's going to be a really interesting balance. At what point do we say, this mother-in-law joke doesn't have to feature a man talking to a woman, it could feature a woman talking to a dog or to, or in anything, to make it funny or weird again. Obviously that's going to affect our metadata. So we're going to have to capture the good data before we encourage the playfulness and the sort of subversion of it, I think. But this is all stuff we're just going to have to figure out as we go, I think. And we're just kind of experimenting at the moment. But it's issues we're thinking about for sure.
I have one final question before we end the grilling, unless anyone else would like to.
I had a slightly more meta question.
Yeah,
okay.
No, you go for it.
That sounds obvious.
Probably what we're talking about. So.
I'm just really curious because there's been so much work at the moment on tracking the reuse of text and images and spread. And I'm wondering is it purely a technology-led question, or is it a deeper historiographical moment that somehow makes those methods more attractive and more resonant?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think certainly in terms of the reuse we're talking about here, obviously it's all to do with social networking as we're seeing it's working. As I mentioned earlier, all this anxiety is about about stealing jokes and which I think that's definitely in the air at the moment. I think it is technology-led, but in a sense, I think the technology has allowed us to ask a question that we've probably been thinking about for a while. So I think it's partly based on the fact that suddenly we have these archives and we can do this kind of work. But also, I think it answers a question that I would have wanted to know for a long time. If I was looking at a joke, I'd think, I wonder who else told this? And before, there's no way I could have answered that. So I think it's a bit of both, right? Technology allows us to do this, and suddenly it's a part of our world, and we suddenly sort of invest a great deal of ourselves or our sense of success in how many times we're retweeted or favorited, or what those favorites or hearts, whatever Twitter isn't doing now, mean. And I think that's very much part of sort of measuring ourselves in very sort of quantified ways at the moment, and our perceived sort of success online is interesting. So I think it's only natural that sort of historians are keyed into that as well. And, you know, and it allows us from that impact point of view to actually send things out into the world and see how people reuse them, to be able to track images using hashtags and various other means. So yeah, I think it's of the moment, but it is answering historical questions, I think, that were probably been bumbling around for a while.
So going back to remixing,
yep.
You mentioned archival remixing as one of your interests, and you mentioned creative remixing.
Yep.
And it struck me to some extent that you're also kind of remixing reading experience here. And perhaps actually, Victorians read newspapers the way I read newspapers. You might actually be faithfully recreating it and actually doing something that's better than the reading experience we've assumed, because you know, people do passionately jump through newspapers.
Yeah.
And maybe they head for the jokes, or maybe they head for something else. Actually, that assemblage of jokes might be how a good chunk of people actually approach that particular newspaper.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was thinking about was that anecdotally, in a couple of conversations recently, someone said to me that a lot of particularly early career historians are actually going back to things like reading experience. They're going back to very material considerations, perhaps in some potential response to the fact that we can keyword search archives, and that they're somehow, though not fully understanding why, they're a little bit troubled with that. And I'm wondering sort of how far, because obviously you come from a background in studying these jokes, in studying newspapers, that is sort of your bread and butter, perhaps. And I wonder how that reading experience, that actual experience of coming across that joke, fits in with a database building project, fits in with something that describes itself as remixing, because I guess remixing in that use of that term implies to some extent a distancing from the original usage to get some other kind of meta meaning out of the material you're looking at.
I see what you mean. I think you're right about the way in which, certainly the way in which it encourages new reading experiences, for sure. I think that's exactly what we're doing. And you're right that some of my anxieties have been sort of driven by the way in which historians perhaps have sort of, I don't know, really prioritised the preservation of the original text to be read in its original format, in its original order. And you're right that we have no evidence to suggest that Victorians read newspapers in that way, that they sat down cover to cover and went through them. We know that they were passed around, that bits were read out, that you would pass on a bit to your wife or to your children, to read their column. So certainly there is the reading experience of these texts. We can access bits, but things like the reading experience database, which is another nice example actually of how you extract content from existing archives and remediate it so that you can focus in on particular forms of use. That shows some evidence, but you're right, it is definitely a sort of an unknowable about how they read these jokes. So I don't feel any anxiety about extracting them and encouraging us to read them in that way, because you're right, I think it's entirely plausible that's how they were read. It's also possible that this is allowing us to capture that oral second life of the joke after it was circulated. You read a joke in your newspaper, you go down to the pub, you say, hey, I read this great thing in the paper, and off it goes into its own kind of world. So I think we shouldn't sort of, I don't know, necessarily hold up that original format and that experience to being the only way to read things. I think it's kind of fun to remix in that way. When I say remixing, I suppose you're right. It does imply that it's taking the original context. I suppose for me, the remixing is more the archival context. It's how we've taken that information and organised it after its original use, which I think has imposed certain forms of reading, certain forms of discovery on texts that weren't necessarily read and discovered in that way. So classic example would be books and newspapers, right? The British Library, it used to be you would go to St Pancras for books, up to Colindale for newspapers. There were literally miles between them. On a Victorian railway station bookstore, they would have been side by side. We create these boundaries, archives do it, we do it within our disciplines, which we say, that's the point at which I stop, I will go no further. The Victorians didn't have that. So I think, breaking down some of those archival and disciplinary boundaries actually is truer to the Victorian guy who goes to a railway station, buys a book, buys a newspaper, tells a joke down the pub, goes to the music hall, transcends all the boundaries that we sort of force upon our research. So I think, I think there's a lot to be said about kind of figuring out how these things would have been read originally, but the sort of great unknown is that we will never know, I think. So in which case, why not play with it? I think it's my philosophy.
So on a point in essence, that all of our archives, including this very room that we're in, are already a remix of the past in some way. Yeah. We should probably draw to conclusion. Before we thank you for a stimulating talk, I just want to flag to everyone in the room and to those online that this is the last digital history seminar of the term. But we will be returning in the spring with a programme of talks starting on the 19th of January with Tessa Houdswell from University College London talking about European or imperial metropolis depiction of London in British newspapers from 1870 to 1900. So keeping our newspaper theme certainly of recent talks. And I hope people are able to attend either in the room or online. But that just leaves us to thank Bob for a wonderful talk. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks very much. Thanks for watching.